All right, guys, forgive the wind noise in the background. I wanted to get this video off my chest as quickly as possible, and this is the only place that I can really record here. Believe it or not, the wind noise is actually going to be much less than if I was inside the house. There's a lot of kid stuff going on, and you know how it is. So anyway, I watched the Donald Trump, Joe Rogan interview yesterday as soon as it came out, and suffice to say, it is, without a doubt, one of the single worst interviews of a major political candidate I've ever seen in my life. It brings me no joy to say that, believe me. So, a lot of stuff to get through here. Basically, it was 3 hours of Rogan glazing Trump with some semi-adversarial questions, semi-inserted a few times. I'm going to give you a full breakdown of the entire thing here. So, right off the bat, let me just say this. Why was the interview so bad? Well, look, I think the format of having two bros hanging out talking shit, it's just completely inadequate when you're dealing with a pathological liar, a massively corrupt billionaire war criminal Epstein buddy. It's just not one where you can sit and shoot the shit and giggle. It's just, the stakes are too high. The stuff on this man's resume is too much to pretend like, yeah, we're just two bros hanging out, doing our thing, and just casually talking. And so that's the bottom line for all the shit people give mainstream media. At least in mainstream media, there's some semblance of being more adversarial than what I watched in that interview yesterday. So I should also point out, there's this Lex Friedman clip where Rogan and Lex are talking, and Rogan gives a very insightful response to the idea that he should have Trump on his show. I actually tweeted it out last night, but he basically says, like, look, I don't want to have anything to do with helping him, whether it's purposeful, I don't want to do that, or inadvertent, I don't want to do that. And you'd be surprised at how much you can rehabilitate somebody's image. And I think Joe's been open about the fact. He's like, look, I'm not the guy for that interview. I don't have the tools to, adequately push back where you need to push back. This is something he's acknowledged in the past. And then now he decided to have him on. So why did he decide to have him on? Look, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there are these other podcasts, people that are in his sphere of influence, people like Theo Von, for example, or Andrew Schultz. And these are guys who have had Trump on. And so now Joe's looking at it, and Joe's a very competitive guy. And he goes, well, if they're going to have him on, and they're going to get, a gazillion view episode with them, well, why shouldn't I also have him on and do the best I think I can in that format? And, I think it's a competitive thing. And I think he sees people who were orbiters of his who are now coming up and their podcasts are blowing up. And he might feel like, well, if I don't do this, I'm, sliding away in terms of relevance and I want to stay the top dog. And so I'm going to do this. But again, as I said, it was honestly a humiliating interview is the best way to describe it. So before I get to the point for point, topic for topic breakdown of exactly what happened and what was said, let me tell you what wasn't asked about. So what wasn't asked about is Israel in the midst of Israel committing a genocide and the U.S. arming and funding Israel to commit that genocide, and Donald Trump saying, the problem with that policy is we're not arming and funding them enough, and we're not supporting them enough. He wants to put the genocide into hyperdrive. That was not asked about. Roe versus Wade was not asked about. The fake elector slates was not asked about. His war crimes were not asked about. His corruption was not asked about. His 91 criminal charges was not asked about. His relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which an article just came out this week saying they were besties and they had a sexual assault game that they played together. And a woman who was a model in 1993 came out and told a very detailed story, which, by the way, fits with Trump's MO completely, the whole grab him by the pussy thing, right? She tells this detailed story about how Trump did that, and Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were buddy-buddy, and there was this weird game that they played where Epstein would bring a woman to Trump, Trump would assault that woman, then afterwards Epstein would act mad about it, and it was a little tee-hee-hee, look at us doing our little fucking sexual assault game. I think if that story came out about any Democrat, Joe Rogan would be talking about it on his podcast endlessly and not bringing on the Democrats who were accused to fucking giggle with them, right? So none of that stuff was asked. None of that stuff was asked. It wasn't asked about, oh, I don't know, Donald Trump's colossal, massive, legendary increase in drone strikes under his administration, over 400% increase, where we had a 330% increase in civilian deaths in Afghanistan. That wasn't asked about. It wasn't asked about him bombing Syria twice, about him bombing Somalia, about him assassinating a top Iranian general, or trying to coup Venezuela, or ripping up the Iran agreement, which helped lead us to this war posture with Iran that we're on right now. It wasn't asked about the U.S. arming and funding a Saudi genocide in Yemen under Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump vetoed a bill to stop us arming and funding a genocide. That wasn't asked about. It wasn't asked, remember when Trump said he wants to do war with Mexico in his second term? Define the drug cartels as a terrorist organization and then go do airstrikes against them? That wasn't asked about. It wasn't asked about him pardoning war criminals like the Blackwater war criminals with the Nisour Square massacre. That wasn't asked about. And so, I'm watching this and I cannot tell you the number of times I facepalmed. I cannot tell you the number of times I was sitting there in awe of the stupidity of this interview. So if independent media, new media wants to suck themselves off and act like, oh, we're special, we're great, we're better than mainstream media, you can't sit there and play fucking patty cakes with a guy like Donald Trump. But that's exactly what happened. All right, so at the very beginning of the interview, the very first question was, hey, nobody's been attacked in a more coordinated way than you, Donald Trump. What are your thoughts on that? Hey, Joe, you were one of those people who would regularly attack Donald Trump. In fact, one of the things I said to one of my buddies after watching this is somebody's got to put together a massive compilation, a supercut of all the times Joe Rogan took shots at Donald Trump over the years. Because over like a 7-8 year period, he said so many things about that guy. He's called him a ridiculous person. He says that, he needs to take psychedelic drugs because he's like too self-interested and he needs to see the bigger picture. I remember when he had Sam Harris on to shit on Donald Trump for like 2 hours straight, and Joe was sitting there nodding along in agreement. Joe famously talked about how he thinks Donald Trump is on uppers all the time, and he cited some prescription for Adderall from like the 1990s or some shit to talk about that. The number of criticisms Joe has made of Trump, it's endless. It's endless. All that out the window, none of that brought up to Trump's face, and he says, oh, you've been attacked in such a coordinated way. Nobody's been attacked more than you have in a coordinated way. And it's like, okay, well, if that's true, you're in on the coordinated attacks, Joe. You are. He asked him, what was it like on day one? And this is one where, again, Trump's cognitive decline really started to show, because Joe asked him that like 3 or 4 times. And every single time, Trump would go off in a different direction, go off on a different topic. He somehow ended up talking about the assassination attempt against him. And Joe was like, okay, but to come back to the question, what was it like on day one? He was trying to get him to explain, like, what's it really like when they get you in the Oval Office and they sit you down. He's probably thinking of that old Bill Hicks joke where they show you an assassination of JFK from a new angle nobody's ever seen before, and then they look at you and go, any questions? Right? So in other words, like, don't step out of line too much, motherfucker. He was looking for an answer like that, but instead he got Trump babbling about the assassination attempt and the Lincoln bedroom and walking down the road in D.C. and waving to the crowd and whatever other bullshit he was spewing. Then he asked him, this was probably the first semi-adversarial question. He said, did you make mistakes with some of your picks? And then he goes on to say, like the neocons. So Trump then takes that and proceeds to defend picking John Bolton, telling a story about how he was warned not to pick John Bolton and he didn't listen. More on that in a second, because this is like the semi-adversarial question is that as adversarial as it'll ever get. And I'll tell you the other areas where he sort of asks a question that's slightly oppositional. He says, Joe pretended at one point like the media didn't sufficiently cover the Trump assassination attempts. Which, of course, I find preposterous. There was nonstop coverage of that for an extended period of time. Joe says the media loves to take things out of context and compare you to Hitler. This is happening the exact same week that a story comes out from, this is now the third top administration official of Trump's, who's a conservative Republican, who has come out and said, yeah, this guy's a fascist to the core. There are 3 top administration officials, 2 generals and 1 chief of staff, who've come out and said, yeah, he's a fascist. And the chief of staff, John Kelly, came out this week and said Trump would bring up, hey, why can't you be like the German generals? And he was like, what do you mean, the Kaiser's generals? Like, who? Like, what are you talking about? And Trump would basically be like, no, the Nazi generals. So maybe the comparison to Hitler is being made because Trump brought up Hitler and somebody is objectively and soberly reporting on what was said. Maybe that. The idea that it's like made up out of whole cloth. That, oh, yeah, we're all just going to compare Donald Trump to Hitler for shits and giggles. No, there's actually a logical thread. And if Joe followed these stories, he would know that. And he wouldn't make himself look so ridiculous by, oh, they like to compare you to Hitler. No, Trump is the one who brought up Hitler to his chief of staff, and his chief of staff warned us about that. Just like Mark Milley and one other general warned us, yes, he's a fascist. So what are we supposed to do, Joe? Not talk about conservative Republicans who are ideologically in alignment with Trump, who say, yeah, this guy's a problem, this guy's a fascist, this guy's sympathetic to dictators? Jesus fucking Christ. They talked about how mainstream media is so crooked that it's opening people up to new media, to which I would respond, Joe, you are giving a masterclass in that 3-hour interview as to why it is not the case that, by definition, mainstream media is better than alternative media or new media or independent media is better than mainstream media. No, you're showing that you could have the same sort of pressures, the same sort of conflicts of interest impact somebody in a new media setting or an independent media setting. And this is Exhibit A to that effect. They go on, both Trump and Rogan, to rip defund the police. They, of course, say that Kamala Harris supports that, which is hilarious. Kamala Harris is a cop. The idea that Rogan doesn't know or Trump doesn't know that the stuff Kamala Harris was saying in 2019 was for posturing in a Democratic primary is absurd. They obviously know Kamala Harris has no interest whatsoever in the Green New Deal or any other so-called far-left policy. I mean, this is obvious, right? This is obvious to anybody who knows the first thing about politics, but they have to sit there and pretend like Kamala Harris is going to defund the police when she was a cop. Like, what are we talking about here? They rip free sex changes to illegal immigrants. I'm not kidding. They actually had a conversation about that. Rogan said to Trump, quote, she stole your idea of no tax on tips. I mean, there's so much to say about just that topic alone because, so Trump came up with that. And then there was a detailed report about how this is a colossal loophole to have like venture capitalists and hedge funders take their salary as a quote unquote tip so that some of the richest people in the country, these massive executives, don't have to pay any taxes. That's the purpose of that proposal from Donald Trump. It's a massive loophole to get his rich buddies to pay no taxes. Now, of course, Rogan has no idea about this. He thinks it's like a populist policy. What's the actual populist policy? Well, Kamala Harris did come out a week later and said, we're going to do no tax on tips, but just for service and hospitality workers. So in other words, she takes Trump's idea, which was a massive loophole for the wealthy, right? And she goes, let's get rid of that massive loophole for the wealthy part and just take the good part of it and say we're going to do no tax on tips for service and hospitality workers, which actually is a populist policy. But of course, you know, to them it's just, oh, Kamala stole your idea of no tax on tips, even though Trump's idea of that is objectively horrible and is just a loophole for the rich. And Kamala's idea of that is actually one that would help working class people and wouldn't be a massive loophole for the rich. See, this is what I'm talking about. Like, if you're going to have this conversation, you have to fucking come prepared. You have to know stuff about policy. You have to do the homework. And he didn't do it. He just didn't do it. He asks, this is what Rogan said to Trump, did you float getting rid of income taxes and replacing it with tariffs? To which Trump says, yes. And then Rogan's like, wait, are you serious about that? And Trump's like, yes. So Trump's seriously floated the idea of getting rid of all income taxes and replacing it with tariffs, which, by the way, would be the most massive redistribution of wealth from the working class to the wealthy in our lifetimes. That would be the most regressive tax imaginable. Basically, everything would shoot up at least 20% in terms of prices. Working class people would get hit the hardest, and the wealthy would have to pay basically no taxes, right? Massive, massive regressive tax idea, but he floated it as if he was serious about it. Both Trump and Rogan go on to suck off Elon Musk. We all knew that was coming when this episode was announced. You ready for this? Now we get to finally one more semi-adversarial question. Rogan says, one of the criticisms of your administration is that you increase the deficit. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. One of the first adversarial questions, or semi-adversarial questions, is Rogan pushing Trump from a further right-wing perspective, doing the whole deficit and debt fear-mongering routine. I mean, it's a joke. This is a joke. Rogan goes on to ask, hey, why aren't we fracking and doing more oil drilling? Trump bragged about having, quote, the cleanest air and the cleanest water, which is another clear example of Rogan not doing his homework and not being prepared, because if he did, he would immediately fire back and say, well, hold on now. You got rid of a lot of clean water and clean air protections. This is not an opinion. This is a fact. Rogan goes on to ask another semi-adversarial question. You ready for what this one's about? Ready? He asks him about nuclear power and asks why he's not more pro-nuclear power. The deficit and nuclear power are the strongest adversarial questions that we've gotten so far. Trump goes on to do his standard bit. You remember this when he complains about, they're not raking the forest. They need to rake the forest to prevent the wildfires. And then both Trump and Rogan go on to shit on windmills relentlessly. There's one point where they say the windmills are driving the whales crazy, and Trump says, quote, I want to be a whale psychologist. I want to be a whale psychologist. I don't know. You try to make sense of that for me. There's a point where Rogan starts to ask a semi-adversarial question about Trump denying the 2020 election, but mid-sentence, he pivots and drives it directly into a ditch, and he goes on to suck off J.D. Vance for not answering if Trump lost in 2020. Because remember when J.D. Vance tried to do that stupid jujitsu move and say, did Trump win 2020? Well, what about Democratic censorship on Facebook? So he started to ask, hey, like, why do you deny the 2020 election? But then he says, I love what J.D. Vance said the other day when he was asked if you won the 2020 election, and he completely and utterly fucking dodged it because he's a liar and he knows he's lying. And he accused the Democrats of doing censorship on Facebook. Like, Joe Rogan is now so thoroughly embedded in a right-wing ecosystem, both with his friend group and his media diet, that he saw that J.D. Vance moment that everybody in the country looked at and said, this guy's a fucking dodging little weasel bitch boy. And he said, oh, what a masterful way to flip it back on the Democrats, sir. It's unbelievable. Again, Rogan tries again to ask a semi-adversarial question about the 2020 election, but yet again, he veers off and steers it into a ditch and ends up saying, quote, the denial of election results is a pretty common thing. Hillary did it. Look, anybody who's still comparing what Hillary Clinton did to what Donald Trump did in 2020, that's just dishonest at this point. Everybody knows Hillary came out the next morning and conceded. Yeah, she said stuff like, I think he's an illegitimate president because I think he had help from the FBI and I think he had help from Russia and I think that's unfair or whatever. She conceded the next morning. Trump did not concede, to this day still pretends he won, and did illegal, fraudulent elector slates and tried to pressure Mike Pence to not accept the certification of Joe Biden. These things are not remotely comparable. And the other examples that Republicans give of two previous elections where they say, oh, this was the same thing that Trump did, that the Democrats did in the past. Nonsense. In the past, they used some example from the 1960s with Hawaii. In the past, those examples were all about genuinely alternative slates of electors. Hey, we don't know who won this election yet. We're going to do a recount. We'll have an alternate slate of electors. And if this person wins, then we'll end up using those electors. If they don't, then we won't. The difference is, with Trump, they weren't alternate slates of electors. They were fake or fraudulent slates of electors. That's not me speaking. That's them speaking internally in their own emails. The Trump team speaking internally in their own emails. In other words, hey, the secretaries of states and the governors already said we lost. We know we lost. We don't care. We're still going to pretend we won. We're going to have fake elector slates and try to shove through Trump as the victor, even though Joe Biden won. That is, no other time in U.S. history has that happened with that set of facts. Never. Never. They lie and try to bring up somewhat similar examples, but they're just wrong. It's not true. Jesus fucking Christ. Jesus fucking Christ. Then, Rogan asked Trump, how would you have stopped Russia from going into Ukraine? Right? Because Trump always said, I would have stopped it. I would have stopped it immediately. It never would have happened. And so Rogan goes, how would you have stopped Russia from invading Ukraine? And Trump's response is very simple. I'd say, Vladimir, you're not doing it. You think I'm kidding? I'm literally not kidding. This is almost a direct quote of what Trump said. I'd say, Vladimir, you're not doing it. Then both Trump and Rogan go on to rip the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's always fun. Trump promised to get out of Afghanistan. He didn't get out of Afghanistan. Biden actually had the balls to get out of Afghanistan. But since there weren't puppies and rainbows and everything going smoothly, therefore, now the media gets to rip into shreds these people who were all in favor of withdrawing from Afghanistan. Now rip it nonstop and act like it was a mistake. Trump himself has already now come out and admitted, I actually wasn't serious about withdrawing from Afghanistan. I would have kept thousands of U.S. troops there in Bagram Air Base. So that's great. One of those things where all of us agreed, of course we got to get out of Afghanistan. We should have never fucking been in Afghanistan in the first place. And then boom, Biden actually does something based in good, and everybody turns on him and shits on him for doing the thing we all said we wanted him to do. Okay, that's great. So they both shit on him for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Very anti-war of you to say we should stay in Afghanistan. Then Rogan praised Trump for, Rogan praised Trump for calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man on Twitter. Because, that's brilliant statecraft Trump was doing there. Trump did his enemies from within routine. He's been saying that endlessly, that actually the biggest problem is not these foreign dictators or our adversaries or even the undocumented immigrants in the country. The biggest problem we have is the enemy within. In other words, that's Donald Trump saying everybody who doesn't agree with me, everybody who's not part of MAGA, they are the enemy within. And I hate them. And he's gone on to say in the past, I would use the National Guard or the military to go after them. Of course, he's talking about journalists and people like that. And Rogan didn't push back even a little bit. Even the tiniest bit, Rogan didn't push back. Rogan goes on to defend Trump killing the border bill, and he asks him a dumb question about, hey, doesn't that bill have amnesty? And aren't the Dems moving illegals into swing states to vote for Democrats? Of course, those things are not true. That bipartisan border bill was written by James Lankford, a super conservative Republican. It would actually shut down the process of, people coming into the country after a certain number. There would be no more hearings after a certain point. But the right spun that, or I should say the MAGA right spun that and made it seem like, oh, you're allowing X number in and they get total amnesty. That's not true. It's a super right-wing border bill, adds 1,500 new border agents, adds new, drug technology where they try to track the flow of fentanyl and other things. So, and then, by the way, Biden went on to do massively conservative executive orders after Trump intervened to kill the conservative border bill. So, look, the real criticism of the Democrats is you are too much like the Republicans on the issue of the border. But, of course, that's not Rogan's criticism. That's not Trump's criticism. They pretend like, like this bill is an amnesty bill and it's a super left-wing bill. And the whole point of it is Democrats trying to get illegal votes, which, of course, is preposterous. Every study that's looked into voter fraud, Democrats doing voter fraud shows there's absolutely no voter fraud whatsoever. You're more likely to get struck by lightning than there is to be voter fraud committed. Think about it. People who are terrified, who are undocumented, who are terrified of getting shipped out of the country, right? Yeah, they're going to go try to vote illegally and put a target on their back for, immigration to come grab them and ship them out within a week, right? God damn it. Jesus Christ. I'm losing my mind over here. So then we also have, they end up talking about the UFC for an extended period of time. They both suck off RFK for an extended period of time. They talk about vaccines. This part was particularly loathsome because, so they start talking about vaccines. Trump jumps in and is like, well, I know you're against certain vaccines. I know you're against certain vaccines, but you got something like the polio vaccine, and the polio vaccine saves so many people. I mean, it really is an amazing thing. So Trump is defending polio vaccines. What's Joe's response? Joe wonders if the kids in Gaza who are now getting polio, he wonders if they're getting polio from the vaccines. Yeah, Joe. In the midst of a genocide where basic things like anesthesia are not being allowed in, food, fuel, and water are not being allowed in, all the kids in Gaza were just getting the polio vaccine, and then that's the thing that gave them polio. No, it's not the massively unsanitary conditions and the lack of vaccines and the fact that there's a genocide going on and there's Lord only knows 100 people per toilet if there's any running water and plumbing, etc. This is... There were moments where I was like, how is Rogan actually saying things worse than Trump. It was incredible. Here's another hard-hitting question from Joe. Quote, how are you so healthy? Is it golf? Trump says, no, I think it's genetics. I think it's genetics. Rogan also goes on to give us this gem. I wonder what the Rogan of 6 years ago would have to say about this comment. Ready? Quote, the rebels are Republicans now. You want to be punk rock and buck the system? I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? That says it all about Joe Rogan and his trajectory and where he's ended up. This part particularly triggered the shit out of me. Rogan says, quote, the liberals are pro-censorship now, and they're anti-free speech now. And he goes on this long diatribe about how horrible the liberals and the Democrats and the leftists are when it comes to the First Amendment and free speech. Listening to this part, this is where I desperately had to try my best to not go into the kitchen, grab a butcher knife, and saw both of my ears off. Because I can't even tell you the number of times we've debunked this on our show. But it's over a dozen times we've brought this up. Donald Trump is the single worst president when it comes to the First Amendment in our lifetimes. And it's not particularly close. Donald Trump is a menace to the First Amendment and free speech. He is massively pro-censorship. He's massively anti-freedom. Trump is out there saying we should punish flag burning with a year in jail. There was literally already a Supreme Court case that said, look, that's free speech. That's protected by the First Amendment. You can't crack down on it even if you don't like it. Trump sued CNN for $475 million for calling his election denialism the big lie. Trump sued Bill Maher for $5 million over a joke. Trump has said he supports, quote, opening up the libel laws to sue journalists. He called for the journalists who reported on the Supreme Court abortion ruling. He called for jailing them. Trump has said he wants to deport pro-Palestine protesters for exercising their free speech and being anti-Israel. Trump did a gag order for the entire EPA to stop them from telling the truth on climate change. He arrested and charged 6 journalists for felony rioting. He said he was going to pardon Assange. He didn't pardon Assange. He didn't pardon Snowden. He didn't pardon Daniel Hale. He, of course, has said he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act to go after George Floyd protesters. And then he called to terminate all rules, regulations, and articles in the Constitution over his election loss. So the idea that the Democrats are a threat to free speech and the First Amendment, and the Democrats are pro-censorship, when you are sitting across the table from the most pro-censorship and anti-free speech president in our lifetimes, is mind-boggling to me, bro. I mean, you want to talk about fucking narrative humping. This is the biggest narrative humper bullshit that I've ever seen in my life. I don't know, all my right-wing idiot friends and the entire media ecosystem I'm in, everybody here says Democrats are bad on free speech and Trump is good on free speech. So I'm just going to regurgitate that, as opposed to doing any research, any reading as to the actual record when it comes to free speech and the First Amendment. What am I supposed to do with this, bro? What am I supposed to do with this? Then Trump and Rogan go on to downplay the 91 criminal charges that Trump was facing. So in other words, Joe outright implies that, yeah, all those charges are just, no pun intended, trumped up charges. It's political prosecution or persecution. Like, that's the implication of how he talks about it, which is kind of amazing because you and I both know. Did Joe Rogan do any extensive reading on any one of the 91 criminal charges? Has he gone into the details of any one of them? Has he read a single indictment against Trump that has been released? The answer is no. So he didn't do his homework, but he helps Trump launder his image by brushing aside, oh yeah, the 91 criminal charges, whatever, that's just political persecution from the evil, nefarious Democrats. It's not that Trump is a criminal who committed a lot of crimes and now he's being held accountable for said crimes. It's definitely not that. He's already been found guilty on some of these charges. He's already been found guilty. And then there's others, by the way. If Rogan read this stuff, he would know about this. Literal Trump-appointed judge trying to throw out some of the most slam dunk cases against him, right? Is that worthy of a question? Is that worthy of talking about? No, of course not. Of course that's not worthy of talking about. Because you want to help him launder his image, so you go out there and say, oh yeah, they're politically persecuting you. Forget the 91 criminal charges. I don't know anything about any one of those charges. I've read nothing about any of them, but I'm going to help you launder that. What are we doing? What the fuck are we doing? Then Trump goes on to say, this is one of my favorite lies in the whole podcast. Trump goes on to say that he never said lock her up. And it was his audiences, his crowds, his fans would say lock her up. And he'd go, oh, hold on now, hold on now, hold on. Joe, you couldn't even interject there to say, well, that's not true. Jamie, pull up a video of Trump saying, lock her up, and you could pull up a fucking compilation that lasts 5 minutes long of him saying, lock her up. He said it all the fucking time. He said it all the time, and you let him sit there and lie to your face. A brazen, disgusting lie. You let it fly. Unbelievable. See, this is what I'm saying. You can't have a pathological liar, corrupt billionaire, war criminal, Epstein buddy, sit there across from you and just take him at face value. Yeah, whatever he says, I'm going to flow with it. I'm going to vibe with it. This isn't like talking to your UFC buddy. It's not. This is not like shooting the shit with another comedian. It's not. The guy is a fucking liar and a criminal. Like, what are we doing here? You're just going to let him get away with everything. Okay. All right. That's what it is. Then I love this one. So again, this is supposed to be semi-adversarial. Rogan says to Trump, how do you think you were robbed in 2020? Others cut you off on this question. I won't do that. Oh, well, thank you, Joe, for being way better than the losers in mainstream media. Thank you for that. We appreciate it. Let him ramble uninterrupted with his endless lies on 2020. Now, on this portion, he slightly pushes back, where he basically says, like, are you ever going to release, like, proof of all this stuff? And Trump is like, well, we already did. We already did. Then he goes on to babble about whatever, Hunter Biden's laptop or some bullshit. He says that none of the changes with, like, the mail-in voting, he's like, none of that was legal. None of that was legal. None of that passed. What are you fucking talking? That's obviously a lie. Oh, my God. Jesus Christ. So, he does his election denialism tap dance. There's one point where Trump is like, I lost by the tiny 22,000, but I won. But I lost by the tiniest amount, but I won. Okay, what are we doing? This part really triggered me as well. Rogan and Trump both say that Kamala shouldn't have picked Tim Walz because, again, Trump's a partisan hack who's running on the other side. Obviously, he's going to say that. But Rogan, his ecosystem, his media diet, his friend group, right wing. And so he thinks like, well, what do you mean? I saw some videos on Twitter of Tim Walz moving in an effeminate fashion. So obviously she shouldn't have picked this guy. This guy was a bad pick. Oh, I don't know, Joe. Maybe the reason why Kamala picked Tim Walz is, number one, he's won in a red district time and time again when he was a congressman. I don't know. That's pretty fucking impressive. To get crossover votes, hold your base, and get Republicans to vote for you. Number two, he's great in interviews. He's great on the campaign trail. And number three, maybe it has something to do with what he actually accomplished. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were talking about politics, the root of which is policy. I naively thought policy matters. I naively thought that's the most important thing when talking about politics. So why did Kamala pick Tim Walz? I don't know. Maybe because he did free school breakfast for kids in Minnesota and free school lunch for kids in Minnesota. Maybe he did legal weed, which is something you, Joe Rogan, say you love. This guy legalized weed. He hasn't got a fucking word of credit from you, even though he's done a lot of the things that you say you'd like. His entire economic record and his entire foreign policy record is stuff that Joe Rogan would say he supports on his show. But he doesn't know Tim Walz did these things, or he doesn't care, and he spends his time shitting on Tim Walz instead of actually going through the record. Jesus fucking Christ. He did 12 weeks paid family leave and 12 weeks paid sick leave. That's incredibly based. That's not something a lot of other governors are doing. They're not materially helping their constituents as much as Tim Walz has done. He did red flag laws for guns, so if somebody says, I'm going to go shoot up a school, you can take their guns in that instance. He did universal background checks for guns. He did free public college, something that Rogan has said he supports in the past. He increased funding for K-12 schools. He raised the pay for nursing home workers. In 2008, when he was a congressman, he opposed the Wall Street bailouts. Again, something Rogan supports. This is a guy who raised the minimum wage for small businesses in Minnesota. He raised taxes on multinational corporations. He banned medical providers from withholding care over debt. He raised the pay for construction workers. He did a massive infrastructure bill in Minnesota. When he was in Congress, he opposed the Iraq War. He fought the neocon deep state twice when they tried to bomb Syria. He tried to block the U.S. from sending weapons to Saudi Arabia as they do a genocide in Yemen. So I don't know, maybe the reason it was a phenomenal pick is because his record is stellar. But of course that doesn't come up. Doesn't even come close to coming up. It's just this smug swatting aside of, oh yeah, Tim Walz, what a fucking asshole. Jesus Christ. All right. And then they both do the Eric Adams conspiracy theory where they bring up how, oh, the reason why the deep state is now going after Eric Adams is because Eric Adams changed his position on immigration. And he used to be more lax on it, and then he became very conservative on it. And as soon as the deep state saw that, they decided, we need to charge this guy. I'm not kidding. This is the theory that they floated. I mean, this is literal, like, 5 IQ bullshit from right-wing Twitter, and they're running with it. No, the problem with Eric Adams, and again, I guarantee you, none of them read any of the articles, any of the facts, any of the indictment of Eric Adams. The reason why they're going after him is because he's a shameless and obvious criminal who was involved in deep corruption with the Turkish government. But I know, it's so nerdy and dorky to actually learn the facts about it before you pontificate and pretend like it's part of some giant conspiracy theory. I love it. It's like, the idea is like, well, you know, the deep state only goes after Republicans, and they don't go after Democrats. But when they do go after Democrats, it's because the Democrats are now kind of like Republicans. What about Hunter Biden? What about Bob Menendez? Right? Eric Adams? Like, oh, Jesus. I'm going to give myself an aneurysm, y'all. I'm going to give myself an aneurysm. Joe asked Trump, how can we stop election fraud? Which, again, is a hilarious question. The idea, like, you're taking at face value that Trump is serious about this issue of election fraud, and he's just trying to dot the I's and cross the T's and get the job done and fix our elections. No, he's using it to pretend like he won, and he's using it, again, to try to pretend like if he loses this time, it's not legitimate. And they go on to talk about how mail-in ballots are for cheating. Absolute nonsense. And, you know, how could you not want to have voter ID? This is crazy. I'm sure that Rogan has literally never heard a single argument as to the problems with voter ID. But he kept saying, like, bro, I'm trying to steal, man. Why anybody would be against voter ID, but I can't think of anything except Democrats want to steal the election, bro. I mean, this is comical at this point. They go on to shit on trans stuff and open borders because, of course, then Rogan asks him about the JFK files, to which basically Donald Trump admits that, yeah, I didn't release it last time, but this time, bro, I promise, bro, this time, bro, it'll be different, bro, I swear, bro. Then they go on to talk about UFOs, only the serious topics. And then there's one point in the discussion about UFOs where Trump says, there's no reason not to think that, like, Mars has life, for example. And even Rogan is like, what? No, there's no life on Mars. We know that for sure. The question is there extraterrestrial life, like, outside of our solar system, outside of our galaxy or whatever? And then finally they were talking about manufacturing a little bit. Joe asked about manufacturing stuff in the U.S., like phones, for example. And Trump basically said, look, we don't make anything. We don't make anything here in the U.S. We don't even make the chips. And then I'm pulling my hair out there because, of course, Joe Biden did the CHIPS Act. Biden and Kamala Harris created 800,000 manufacturing jobs in this country. One area where you cannot say they underperformed is union stuff, for example. You cannot say they underperformed with the NLRB and the FTC with all the great work Lena Khan is doing over there. Job creation, manufacturing job creation, because they're doing industrial policy where you invest in factories here to bring jobs back. That's not Trump's idea. In fact, Trump goes on to flat out say this. He doesn't want to do any industrial policy in the sense that you subsidize industries to build massive factories here. Trump says, what do you just tariff the foreign companies and then that'll fix it? As if that's the full picture. No, that's half the picture. You want to tariff some foreign goods and have our goods here that compete with them? Sure. But you got to put the tariffs on the foreign goods, but then you have to do industrial policy here and invest here to build the factories. He's just hoping that the free market will fix it and, hey, the CEOs will decide to build factories here. All we need to do is tariff them. That's not true. That's fucking half the picture of industrial policy. Unbelievable. Unfucking believable. So to reiterate here, the two bros hanging out format is just completely inadequate when dealing with somebody like Trump, who's a pathological liar. He's a massively corrupt billionaire. He's a war criminal. He's an Epstein buddy. There wasn't a single question about Israel or Roe v. Wade or the fake elector slates or Trump's war crimes or his corruption or his 91 criminal charges. I mean, by the way, stop and think about it. Joe all the time has talked about the sketchy things with Democrat, like the Hunter Biden Burisma thing and the Clinton Foundation and how shady that is. He was sitting across from Donald Trump. He didn't ask a single question about what's been in the news a lot lately, the $100 million that Miriam Adelson sent Trump with the quid pro quo of, hey, you need to let Israel completely annex the entire West Bank. That didn't come up, that Trump just took a $100 million bribe to let Israel annex the West Bank. Didn't come up. You know what else didn't come up? The $2 billion that the Saudis gave to Jared Kushner. Yeah, that's not fucking sketchy at all. Imagine Hunter Biden took $2 billion from the Saudis. These guys would never shut the fuck up about it. But it's Jared Kushner and nobody brings it up. I mean, how about the tens of millions of dollars that Trump took from Saudi Arabia for his live golf events? That's kind of fucking sketchy. Hey, remember when you vetoed a bill that was to stop arming Saudi Arabia as they committed genocide in Yemen? Trump? No, none of this came up. None of it fucking came up. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. It gives a bad name to all of so-called independent media and new media. Basically sat there and glazed him for 3 hours and played patty cakes with him. Look, if you're going to do an interview like this, you have to come prepared. You have to know the facts. You have to be deep on policy. Instead, you didn't, and now Trump, the pathological liar, was pathologically lying and running circles around you. And it absolutely helps with laundering his image. It absolutely helps that. The same thing Rogan warned could happen if he had Trump on. That's exactly what ended up happening. Now, ultimately, will it have an impact on the election? I don't know. Obviously, it's getting tremendous views. I literally don't know if it'll have an impact. My gut tells me probably not, because Trump's strategy at this late date is to do the whole podcast circuit and try to turn out low propensity voters, namely young men, to go vote for him. I don't know, man. I don't know. I mean, Bernie tried the strategy of turning out people who don't normally vote that much, and it didn't really work that well. And I think Trump might run into the same problem. It's just a much lower percentage of this particular demographic that goes and votes. But having said that, the margins are so tight that any little thing could maybe push it over the edge in one direction or the other. So maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. But humiliating and embarrassing is all I have to say about this. Humiliating and embarrassing. I'm not sure there was a single part of that podcast that was redeeming. I'm not sure there was a single part of that podcast that was sufficiently adversarial. And I think that's the obvious takeaway.